Alrighty, there's a lot of kinds of planning that we do in life. I would say what to eat for lunch, that's pretty critical. But now planning gets more important all the time in oil and gas, gets more complex all the time. Internal planning is complex enough, but it's not necessarily the biggest driver anymore, especially if you're drilling in the subdivisions, if you're drilling in town. A lot of planning has got to do with your external stakeholders, such as members of the public. And the members of the public, we used to say, well, it matters what the public thinks. But yeah, it's no longer just this vague goodwill thing. The public opinion can derail your project, and it can keep you from getting permits. So you've got to sell your project, and your project has got to meet certain specifications. I was looking at this slide and I was noticing the words on this slide, they get smaller and smaller and harder to understand as you go down. And I thought, now this is one of those slides that's all words and it makes your eyes glaze over, and I thought, man, now that's a metaphor for the planning process. The details of the planning process get smaller and more granular as you go along, and there's more and more like minutiae involved. So as this slide is really kind of a metaphor for the planning process. But seriously, suppose that internal to your company you've got this planning process. Suppose your geologist knows where we're going to drill and frack. Okay, then what? Well, you got to arrange to own or lease the minerals, and you need an arrangement to use the surface space if you don't own it, which is pretty likely. And you need to line up contracts with different contractors, and for some materials your contractors will go out and get them, and for some other materials you're going to need to line them up. And for frack water, you're going to need to get the water from somewhere, and there's a lot of it. And you're going to need financing, either internal or external. So if it's internal, you're going to need to compete with other projects internally, and if it's external, then you've got to go and get loans from a bank, and you need to show them that you're going to be able to make money and pay them back. For that, you need production forecasts, so you know how much you're going to make, so that you can make a business case. So you run reservoir simulations, but to run the reservoir simulations, you need to know how many fracks per well and how much water per well, so you know how much the water costs. Well, the water company wants to know how much we're buying, so we can get a volume discount, so it's this chicken and egg thing, right? Oh, no worries, we do that all the time. You just make some kind of assumption, you calculate everything, and then you start over from there. Right? And that's great as long as everybody understands that that's what's going on. Otherwise, it just gets to be a real mess. Well, here's the pretty picture version. We identified the drill site. Then we've got all those different teams: risk management, drilling, land, revenue and marketing. And when I started working risk management, we didn't necessarily have that team, but we sure do now. Up front in the planning process, we take this information from reservoir and geology, identify these drill sites, and then these various teams work on it in parallel. And the company will rank out possible projects. Usually there'll be a formal process for that. A lot of times there'll be a fit-for-purpose software, something like Aries or PEEP, that you use for that. The inputs are your projected production and your projected costs. And then you also have intangible factors like how that project impacts your company's reputation. If you drill right next to a school, are you going to get public opposition that will mess you up on your next project? You take all that stuff, you put it into your process, and you go through this ranking process. After you go through that ranking process, you decide which projects you're going to drill. And you decide, say, we're going to drill and frack 50 wells in such and such area. Say they're in Oklahoma. Then you're going to deploy what looks like a bunch of additional teams. Drilling, completions, contracts, and purchasing. But really, it's the same people. As far as companies I work for, it's going to be the same people, but in different roles. If you take a look at the drilling group, your drilling engineer and technicians are going to research wells that have been previously drilled, pull up, say, scout tickets, read well histories, or pull the PASON data that comes from the computers on the rig. Look at these various parameters that are listed here, bit and mud records, the temperature, circulation, etc., and figure out what could we do better, what is it going to cost. They'll go out and get permits, they'll work with purchasing, safety, these other groups. Drilling is the stuff that we kind of fixate on, but there's a bunch of other stuff that we've also got to look at. Facilities, completions, contracts, etc., So all these other ones, all these other groups have got a task list of similar complexity as drilling. Once we've got our permits, we go into our executions phase and start construction of our roads. We drill wells, we frack, we reclaim the part of the site that's not needed for long-term production, etc., During this phase, we've got a lot of scheduling. And that brings me to my next slide. You hear a lot of people say the recent expansion in hydraulic fracturing came about because of technical advances and blah, 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 blah. And you're like, okay, like what? And people will talk about geomechanics and frac fluid and sand and all this stuff, but that stuff's been around. I think one of the bigger things that has happened is people have got better at managing people processes. Scheduling, deployment of people, deployment of materials, and project planning. Things that would be in college taught under construction management programs. Stuff like Gantt charts, which people hate, or people love to hate them. Programs like MS Project, Primavera, making timelines. This kind of concepts is what makes frac possible. So it's not necessarily a bunch of people that bestride the world like a colossus. It's people in the back room making schedules and keeping up big Excel spreadsheets to keep everything going where it's supposed to go. There's a bunch of different planning processes within the oil company. We kind of looked at in this class the one that starts with drilling, so the drilling process, but in any process you're going to conceptualize and plan, implement, and then decommission. So you start with a concept, look at your economics, develop implementation plans, implement it, and then hopefully look back and see how you did and incorporate the learnings for the next time around. Well, this slide's a little busy, but process on the last few slides is like a process in a lot of other industries. I saw a graphic that was real similar to this one when I was attending the University of Wyoming a few years ago. And it was in a presentation from a coal mining company. And I looked at it and I thought, wow, that's exactly what happens in oil and gas planning. So if you look at the y-axis here, is the ambiguity and number of ideas under consideration. And that man had something very similar to that on his slide. So the ambiguity and number of ideas under consideration. And then on the y-axis, the time. And he said, okay, you're going to have divergence of ideas, then convergence of ideas, and then implementation. Your ideas had better come together and people better get on board. And I put little miniature versions of my last slides on there to show where we're at. So when you're in that kind of conceptual phase, you can have some divergence of ideas. You can throw new ideas into the mix. When things start to converge, you really can't throw much more new ideas in. When you're in implementation, people are going to expect you to pretty much get on board and start cranking things out. If you look at that in terms of sort of the facilities engineering side, you'll hear terminology like, okay, order of magnitude scoping, pre-feasibility, feasibility, front-end engineering or FEED, detailed engineering, and construction. So you kind of have this divergence of ideas, convergence, implementation in your planning process. Here's something you see that will confuse people in planning. You see that people estimate costs on the bigger projects over and over and over, and people say, well, why? I thought we already did this estimate. What's happening is people are refining those estimates. So in the feasibility phase, you're doing a real rough estimate to see if the project is feasible. And in front-end engineering, you're refining that to see how does the project compare to the other projects, and then you're doing that ranking by net present value. You put that money in the yearly budget, assuming that it makes the cut, and your cost number needs to be plus or minus 30%. And then in detailed engineering, you come up with your cost for your AFE, for management to approve the money, and then in construction or drilling, you're going to spend the money, and you're going to be keeping track of it, and then you'll know, hopefully, exactly what you spent. Those last few slides kind of talked about how you have different planning processes on different time scales. One thing you'll see in a lot of oil companies is you'll have two different time scales, at least when things are not in a state of upheaval because there's a big downturn. But you'll have a 1-year plan and a 5-year plan. And your major work has got to be in the budget. If it's really major, it needs to be in that 5-year plan. And if it's kind of major, it needs to be in the 1-year plan, or it just isn't going to get done. If you go ask for $1 million mid-year because you think you're brilliant, you are not going to get it. The budget typically for the next year will be drawn up in September or October. Anything that's major, you need a cost estimate by September. So you're going to need to start estimating it in, say, April, or you're not going to have the estimating done by the time you need to put it into the budget. Kind of high level, this is your idealized yearly budget process. You're going to come up with your budget cost, hopefully by September, October. Come up with your AFE cost before the project starts. Hopefully, I've been on some projects where the project was in construction and then we came up with the AFE cost. The cost to complete during the drilling or construction, the project manager that's over that project needs to keep track of that from the invoices as they come in. As you're signing those, you need to put them in a spreadsheet. You cannot wait until accounting keeps track of it and then look in the accounting system, because there's too much of a time lag. By the time accounting gets it in their system, it can come in, sit on the foreman's desk, he signs it, it goes into accounting, it sits in somebody's in basket there, they put it into the computer, and then by the time it shows up in the computer, it can be 3 or 4 weeks. So you can have quite a time lag to get invoices processed. If you wait for that data to show up in accounting, it's way too late to keep track of your costs. You can be way off track by then. Actual cost after the project's done, then look in the accounting system and see what it actually came in at, and hopefully it'll come up the same as your spreadsheet you've been tracking it in. And then get your cost of similar projects and feed that back in to your estimates for the next year. One thing that's kind of new, or new-ish, depending on where you're at, is having local regulators, having a county regulator or a city regulator that can give you permits or not give you permits, as the case may be. Now, in the past, local regulation was limited to certain building permits. Say, like if you had a building larger than 10 by 12, you had to get a building permit, and sometimes people would get the building permit, sometimes they kind of shine it on if they're way out in the countryside. Building permitting has become more complex. For example, this illustration over on the right is cropped out of a part of a site plan for a disposal well in Weld County, and this required permitting just like any mini storage or car wash apartment complex. Oil and gas, in the eyes of a local jurisdiction like Weld County, is just another land use, and just like they require a permit for you to put in an apartment complex, a building permit, they require a building permit for you to put in a tank site or anything else. And they will require, if you put in an apartment complex, they'll require you to improve the road that is next to your apartment complex, and they will require you also to improve the road next to your drill site or to improve the road next to your injection well. My first few jobs I had in the oil patch, I didn't run into any local regulations. We didn't go down to the county and pull permits. And then I went to work for an engineering firm designing oil and gas facilities, and I found out that, hey, we were supposed to have been doing that. You know, there's certain buildings over a certain size, you're supposed to have been pulling permits, and we didn't necessarily do that everywhere. And I'll tell you why some of this comes about. So, for example, in the 1990s, people started to become really aware that people have been regulating, say, pollution in streams. And what people have been doing is saying, okay, these factories discharge into the streams and they're discharging chemicals and it's screwing up the streams. And there's been more and more and more regulation of that. But streams and rivers still had a lot of problems. And people started looking at it and saying, well, where are these problems coming from? Well, where it's coming from is stormwater, just dirt washing into the streams and rivers during big storms. And they said, well, there's always been storms. You know, what's causing it? Well, what causes it is when you have more and more development, when you have a site like this where they go in and they pave or they put in packed gravel over a big area, that when the rain hits it, it runs off faster during a storm. And when you put in incrementally more and more developed area and you have more of this packed down surface, you get a lot of water rushing into the streams during storms. So city and county jurisdictions require site plans and these stormwater plans because of that. That's one of the bigger reasons driving this requirement for site plans is the stormwater. It's not just because they want to regulate things just for regulation's sake. These days we have overlapping industrial and residential land use that we didn't have before. I want to say first that shale development goes by a couple other names that you might have heard. Shale is also called unconventional, and sometimes people call it continuous play because the formations, which I'm showing here as that kind of light green layer that's continuous across the diagram, are continuous and they stretch under a large area, where your conventional formations, which are that dark green one and the red one there, are restricted in area. So this continuousness of these shale formations is what causes the overlapping industrial and residential land use. So in the old days, in this upper graphic, prior to the horizontal drilling and fracking, oil and gas development was economic only in oil fields. So where these little humps are, and they're not necessarily evident on the surface the way I've drawn it. You know, you might have some flat land that's covered up over the top of this, but you'd have these underground hills called anticlines, and your oil and gas would collect in those. And the oil and gas would be present in that light green layer, which is your shale, between the fields, but it would be sub-economic. This would cause your overlapping surface use to be restricted in aerial extent. So as long as you didn't have cities trying to develop in your oil fields, then you wouldn't have residences in the same area as the oil fields. So in those areas where you have no oil field there, you have your cities, your farms there, and your oil field just in that oil field area. But now, because the oil and gas development is economic over that entire area, you have overlapping surface use over that whole area. And in a lot of cases, there's already cities, there's already farms in those valley type areas in between those hills. Now, there may not be hills on the surface, but they're underground hills, those anticlines. In between there may already be cities, there may already be farms. Or not, but they're prospective areas where you could have overlap of these surface uses, the industrial and residential land uses. Now, another contributing factor is urban sprawl. Urban sprawl has expanded towns out into oil fields and into historical farming areas, gravel mining areas like in Thornton, Colorado. It's just been a lot of urban sprawl. Shale drilling has expanded where we can drill, and that makes it possible to recover this petroleum from this formerly marginal rock. Another thing that's going on is we've burned all the easy to recover oil in the U.S. and in other rich countries, and so we're going after more and more marginal reserves. Another parallel development in other industries, if you look at, say, the gravel industry, they've really improved the dust control in that industry, and so it's more plausible to mine gravel in towns. And at the same time, if you talk to construction people, they'll tell you it's hard to get good gravel in Colorado. You think, how can that be? There's rocks everywhere, but the good gravel with the nice hard rocks in it that doesn't have a lot of sedimentary rock or softer rocks in it is harder to get. So people are trying to mine in marginal areas and trying to mine in towns because they say, hey, we can get these dust controllers and it's going to work. There are some people who definitely do not want oil and gas development in their area. So there's definitely going to continue to be conflict over this. Suburban and urban operations take place within what I think of as the land development envelope. Now, land development, people think of things in terms of land uses, and these are the main ones that you have: residential, commercial, industrial, and then I've added a couple more that some people don't usually add, like government and special districts. So residential, the main ones: single family, multifamily, retirement homes, group homes. Commercial, you have stuff like the things you think of, stores, but churches are kind of commercial too. They're not commercial. People say, no, a church is not commercial. But they're the same type of thing. The buildings are kind of the same. And stuff like car wash or mini storage. And those are a couple important ones because there's only certain areas where you can put a car wash in town, and they won't permit it in other areas. Mini storages, they'll permit them in some areas. They'll deny you a permit if you try to put them in other areas. Industrial, stuff like oil and gas, gravel pits, feedlots, private airports. And again, if you try to put a feedlot in certain areas, they will deny the permit. One difference with oil and gas, you have a right to access your minerals. So in general, if we have our act together, we can get a permit in areas where other people cannot. Government. So government is stuff like the roads, the schools, water reservoirs, parks, and venues. Government is a little different animal as far as how they do their permitting. They issue their own permits, so they're different. Special districts, things like toll roads, stormwater systems, big ones. Irrigation districts, water and sewer districts, those are your special districts. So in developing this class, I interviewed a number of subject matter experts because I sure don't know it all about this topic. But one person that I talked to was a director of development for a municipality here in the DJ Basin. He told me, my staff is processing 700 applications. He said 3 of them are oil and gas, and they take up a disproportionate amount of our time. He didn't put it quite as bluntly as that. He's very well-spoken, very, very nice fellow. And that's why he's the director of development for a big municipality, and I'm not. But part of the problem, as he very nicely put it, is that oil and gas people don't know the process, and we're kind of ham-fisted in our dealing with these jurisdictions. We need to learn to read the tea leaves better. We need to know when to take a hint. If the jurisdiction has the expectation that we're going to turn in engineering drawings just like residential and commercial does, go ahead and get them done even if you don't see the point. There's probably some reason people have arrived at this convention of doing that type of analysis. You see people railing against the system, and they don't even know what the system is. You want to have a look at some of the submittal packages that were successful and see what was expected, and do yours likewise. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. Even if the example the jurisdiction shows you is an apartment complex, just say, hey, can I get a copy of that? And go to the outfit that did the drawings for the apartment complex and say, hey, can you make me a package of drawings like this, but I need mine to show a well pad. That is the way to handle it. There's a lot of different regulations, and I'm showing just a real brief flavor for the regulations. As you know, regulations go on and on. Residential and commercial are pretty similar. You can see there's zoning, there's drainage and stormwater, Americans with disabilities. Industrial, our biggest one usually is something called use by special review. And you'll have floodplain and mining, health and safety administration. Government has different ones, and then special districts, those vary quite a lot, and I'm certainly not an expert on special districts. But the thing to focus on here is that the government is not picking on oil and gas. Everybody is regulated. One of the big things that is a difference for mineral extraction is zoning. Zoning, if you look at car washes, mini storages, they cannot get a permit for a residential area. Not whatsoever. An oil well pad, you can get a permit in whatever zoning because you have a right to access your minerals. And car wash and mini storage developers absolutely do not feel sorry for oil and gas. Oil and gas, contrary to popular belief, is not the most regulated industry there is. A lot of clients in commercial and residential are required to do more engineering. They turn in more paperwork than oil and gas. If you're a land developer, this is kind of the world you live in while you're trying to get a permit. It's this so-called entitlement process. You wouldn't buy a property to, say, put in apartments without looking at where it lies in the city's master plan, this comprehensive plan or general plan. You would not think of trying to put apartments in an area zoned for industrial. So the first thing the developer would do if they were buying a property is they look at this comprehensive plan, this general plan, and they say, okay, where's that property in that comprehensive plan? What does the city have in mind for that area? And then they would look at the zoning, and they would look at the land development regulations in that area. And they look at all the ordinances there, and then start seeking their permits. They definitely would not start seeking their permit, and then only that, after that, start looking to see what the requirements are. But what you see sometimes with oil and gas, people go and get their drilling permits, and only after that they start looking to see what's needed for local permits. Or they go and sign a bunch of oil and gas leases, and only after that they start looking to see what is needed for local permits or what there is in the way of local infrastructure. Are there roads that can carry the trucks? Is there any way to hook up to electricity if they require you to run an electric rig? With oil and gas, a lot of times we can drill in areas that are not zoned industrial. So there's an exception for oil and gas. But if you're smart, you need to take a look at this same approach and be aware of how that land you're drilling on fits in the larger scheme of things. If you haven't read the city's master plan, you need to do it. If you don't know what the zoning is in the area where you're leasing, you need to have a look at that. Alright, it is possible at long last to get an approval from a local jurisdiction. It does happen from time to time. And the approvals process is similar for residential, commercial, and industrial. You usually start with a conceptual review in the case of at least residential and commercial, a neighborhood meeting, then site plan review, a response to comments. The staff of the city will send back comments. You revise your site plan, send it back in for staff analysis, and then probably a review by a local board or city council, approval or denial, and then a building permit. So if you look under industrial, a lot of times that conceptual review isn't explicit, but you really need to ask for that, whether it's in the process or not. You need to ask for a conceptual review with the jurisdiction staff. Then you'll have this use by special review process generally. You'll get a response to comments, or they'll send you comments from the staff. You need to write a response to comments. Sometimes there will be a public comment, a lot of times, and you'll need to respond to public comments. You need to allocate staff, and enough staff, to be able to adequately respond to not just the staff comments, but also the public comments. It can be time consuming. Then you're going to need to revise your use by special review permit, and it can be a major exercise to do it. You send it back in, you'll have the staff analysis either before that response to comments phase and then again afterwards. It can involve some major engineering, usually civil engineering works. So not the sort of thing that people are used to doing in the oil field. We're used to more mechanical or process engineering. But civil engineering works like grading plans, things like improvements to the roads, maybe a traffic signal if you're going to have a lot of traffic. It could be a permanent or temporary traffic signal. You'll have the same thing, possible review by a local board or council, so county commissioners, that kind of thing. Approval or denial. Government's a little different process, and then special districts, those vary. One thing that is different for industrial is that generally master plans, if you read a few of them, you find they don't include industrial. They exclude it. You'll have a bunch of stuff on like where we're going to put in bistros, and we're going to put in little hiking trails and all these amenities, but you don't see anything like pipeline corridors. Oh, hey, we're going to put a slaughterhouse over here. You don't see that kind of thing in master plans. Really, Colorado is starting to look at that. I think more municipalities and counties really need to look at industrial as something other than how do we keep this the hell out of our town. Alright, so we hear about controversy and fireworks and people getting mad in these processes, and so here's where that could happen. You know, in your conceptual review, it's going to be you and the staff from the city or the county, and this is purposely to avoid fireworks and to try to get ahead of problems. You should ask for a conceptual review, or maybe 2 or more conceptual reviews ahead of trying to submit a plan. Neighborhood meetings, those you can have some fireworks, obviously. A site plan review or use by special review process, not likely to have all that much when you submit the permit and you meet with staff. When you put stuff out for comment, then you could have a lot of comments come in that are hostile from the public. In general, stuff from staff, not so much. They may be pointed in their comments, but they're likely to be professional. Revising the site plan is internal to your company. Staff analysis, the staff is going to be professional regardless of their personal opinions. Your local boards and councils are elected people. You can have some hostile members of the board. You can have members of the public that show up and can be hostile to your proposal. Well, a person might wonder, how do these processes relate? So you've got this permitting process that I've shown for the city and county permit, and then you've got your permitting process for your state permit. What I've got circled there in red is the first interaction with your agency. your local agency there in the top one, and your state agency in the bottom one. For your land drilling, as opposed to offshore, your state and federal permit process typically has been way over at the end. You do all your planning, and then at the very end, you file for your permit. For land development, if you're building apartments or that kind of thing, you come up with just your basic concept, and then you start interfacing with the city much, much, much sooner. You come up with the basic concept, you interface with them, then you start your design. The building permit, which is equivalent to your drilling permit, is at the end of that land development process. And there's no expectation that the agency will hurry up and get the permits processed. So they'll have some time frame. They'll say, okay, when you turn something in, then it's such and such a number of days for processing, and generally they'll meet that time frame. They don't hold on to things excessively, but they don't have this ethos that we're in service of industry that you do see sometimes with oil and gas commissions or corporation commissions. Not saying I have a silver bullet for interaction with local agencies, but I've got some ideas. Along the top of here, I've rearranged that local agency process. You got your conceptual review, plural, conceptual reviews, neighborhood meeting, use by special review, which is your design process, starts there, jurisdiction, staff comments, etc., right? So I'm saying down there in the bottom, in the middle of that graphic was you're going to plan to drill 50 wells or something. And around the outside, all your different groups, your drilling, your EH&S, your finance, etc. I'm saying you need to have a group for local jurisdiction interface. And it might be a virtual group made out of, say, your drilling engineer, your EH&S, and somebody else, but you need to have a person who is a local jurisdiction interface person. Dedicated paid staff if you're drilling in town. And you need to have a civil engineer. Okay, so local jurisdiction interface there. Then you go through that planning process, your ranking process, then have a more detailed plan and hold that conceptual review again when you get to this next point here. Then start going through these two processes in parallel. Maybe try a focus group first. I've never seen anybody do that, but get a focus group and then do your neighborhood meeting. Instead of trotting everything out in public and just, throwing it up on the wall and see what sticks. Maybe get yourself a focus group that isn't quite so public. Alright, in a city government you got different groups. Now you've got your planning group, but then you've also got your operations group. And it has a lot the same planning process in the operations group as what you've got in an oil company. So on the left here I've got your municipality or county planning process, and they've got engineering firms that are stuck to them, a lot like an oil company has got service companies that are stuck to them. On your, say, 5-year plan, what a municipality would have is a so-called capital improvements plan, CIP, which in the oil field is cement in place. So whenever I see it, I think, wow, there's cement in place. We bumped the plug. That's not quite it. The oil company would have a strategic plan, strat plan, or something like that. Then your yearly plan is about the same thing. They have some kind of yearly budget cycle. You can't spend money unless there's some kind of calamity. And then they'll have asset management systems, some kind of system similar to Maximo. For example, some cities have something called Cartograph, where they manage their road condition data. Same kinds of things in municipal as what you see in oil companies. One thing that's definitely different between municipalities and oil companies is in a municipality, they'll have a 25-year master plan. And one way that they can do that is a municipality really can't cease to exist. They can go bankrupt like Oakland, or they can change names like Bombay became Mumbai, but continuity is kind of a given. You can't really get rid of a municipality. Whereas with an oil company, which is different from a service company, you can't really have a 25-year master plan because the companies change hands more often than that, or they divest from a particular basin. So you might have an individual who stays with the same property for 25 years. The strategy can carry forward in spite of this turnover, but that's not really a master plan because your upper management turns over and over. And the function of master planning in some ways is filled in by academia or service companies, but it isn't really. Now, it's all well and fine that municipalities have master plans, but there's a bit of an issue. We need a plan for industrial land use other than let's get rid of that nasty industry. If the sprawl displaces all the confined animal feeding operations, then where are we going to get food? Because the fact is, we get most of the meat from places like JBS, Five Rivers Feedlot, which is a huge feedlot over by Greeley. If we push all those out, then where are we going to get food? We need all the land uses in the master plan, including stuff like car washes. And we really should put in, okay, we're going to put car washes and mini storages in the master plan. But a lot of master plans just kind of gauzy, vague descriptions of like, oh, we're going to have a little bistro district over here. We're going to have walking along the river over here. And some of them are, not all that. Little different perspective on that. Municipalities and counties can participate in stuff like the Denver Regional Council of Governments, which is for the 8-county Denver metropolitan area, 2.2 million residents, and Urban Drainage and Flood Control District, which is to manage floodwater in a big area. Oil companies can't really do that because of antitrust. Remember the trust busters. You can't really do that, and so it leads to redundant development. So you have, like, for example, one gathering system on top of another. In California, you have a lot of that. You have one pipeline system on top of another, or redundant pipeline systems, which can be good in a way. If one breaks down, you have the other one. But it also is not very coordinated. Professional societies can make recommendations. Those can get incorporated by reference in regulations. That can kind of help. Problem is, those tend to be global, and they tend to be really broad and focused, in my opinion, on big projects and not so much on what they consider to be little bitty things like Wyoming or Colorado or Oklahoma. So there's something kind of missing there. One thing that could be done, perhaps, is a special district might be a way to have a cooperative entity without antitrust. I'm not really sure if that would work or not. I thought I'd put a summary slide here, but instead I've got a list of recommendations. They start early. Be proactive and think about it from the jurisdiction's point of view. Submit consistent documents. Go over them with a fine-tooth comb. Make sure your traffic study matches your facilities map. Make sure everything matches. Get involved in your larger planning efforts like master planning, and don't just exhort your people to get involved and, volunteer and go and take part in this master planning meeting. Have a paid planner on staff and get involved in a formal way. Come up with a 25 to 50-year plan, whether your company's going to be around or not. And do it through SPE, APIs, find a way to do it. Know what your project impact is. To quantify, say, the viewshed impact, you can do that through some of the GIS programs. Light mitigation, sound mitigation, emissions. Know what your emissions are. Don't just say, well, we have 99% reduction in emissions. Well, what does that get you to? Stormwater impact. Know how much stormwater would drain off of your site. How would it impact the streams downhill from you? And I would say, hire or contract a planner, like one that is certified by the AICP association. So these people are urban planners, is what they call them. And they know that process of getting stuff through the local planning process.